Thanks for being here today. We have kind of a special meeting today. We have not only our consultant team in town in person visiting us, but also our new mayor, Mayor Davis, and welcome. We thought we'd kind of start off with a round of introductions, so we can always kind of get to know each other better, and also for Mayor Davis to kind of get to know this group. And then I don't know if you had any kind of starting words or anything for the meeting today, but it's something you're welcome to do if you have anything.
Well, thanks, Ben. I appreciate that.
Are you heading to the council, to the committee meetings at 9?
I'm not going to head to the first ones. I'm going to head back over to City Hall here in a second for another commitment. But I did want to just say good morning and thank you for being here. Thank you for serving the citizens of Missoula in your volunteer capacity and bringing your expertise to the table. My classic line, at least for these first few days, is that I'm new here. But of course, I've worked alongside many of you for many, many years, and it's really an honor and a pleasure. And I just wanted to extend my appreciation. We've had a chance to get caught up a bit. There's a lot going on with this project, and I really appreciate the level of work the staff have done alongside the consultants and folks like yourself that have been spending your time and expertise to help move this along. We got a great update yesterday, which is why I feel okay about being double booked right now. And so I thought I would come over for this first 30 minutes and just say hi, listen again to the introduction, and then I'll probably just slip out here in a little bit, but we'll continue to get caught up and really excited for this next phase. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's just start by going around, and if everyone could introduce yourselves, and especially for the advisory group members, if you could kind of relay or indicate who you see yourself as representing in the community in your role on this group, that would be great. Chris, do you mind starting off?
Sure. My name's Chris Chitty. I'm with Home Architects and Builders. We're a custom home builder and small scale infill developer.
Ashley, she, her pronouns. I'm the community engagement specialist for CPDI.
I'm Kat Cowley. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the director of the Basic Needs Office and Food Pantry on campus at UM. And I'm hopefully here to bring the college student voice with you.
I'm Emily Blanken. I'm a senior planner on the long-range planning team and one of the project managers for our Missoula project.
Leslie Dalla Piazza. I'm recently retired from First Interstate Bank as a commercial banker, so I think I represent to some extent the business community, but also the various neighborhoods that I've lived in.
Toon Pham, I'm on the planning board.
Lavelle Means, and I'm the community planning manager for CPDI.
And I'm going to jump over to the virtual world here, if that's all right. Thomas, do you mind going next? Oh, sorry, you're muted, Thomas.
Oh, sorry about that. Thomas McClure. I'm with All Nations Health Center in Missoula.
Thank you. And Ryan?
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm home with a sick kiddo today who got kicked out of daycare yesterday, so my apologies for not being there in person. Ryan Salisbury, work at civil engineer at WGM Group here in Missoula, and also serve on the Missoula Building Industry Association. I'm the Government Affairs Committee Chair.
Thanks, Ryan. Heather?
Yes, good morning. I too am chasing my tail between meetings this morning and not there in person. My apologies, but I am with Homeward and I am the project development director here and representing Missoula as a community, but also, very direct housing issues, but also serve on several different boards around town, from Garden City Harvest, Home Resource, and other organizations. So just trying to represent all lenses on that front. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's everyone online for now. Raise a hand if I missed anybody, please. I'm Ben Brewer, planning supervisor with CPDI in the long range planning section and a project manager on this project.
My name is Bob Giordano. I direct Missoula Institute for Sustainable Transportation, and that includes the Free Cycles Community Bike Program.
Jamie Kimmel. I'm a partner with Cascadia Partners, so one of the three main leads on the consultant side of the project, and our role is more focused on So the economic analysis and the housing policy considerations for the project.
Ben, just I got a text from somebody asking to be let into the virtual meeting, somebody in the public. They said they're in Teams limbo land right now.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Park. I left my voice in Denver. And I'm one of the three principals on the.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Suter. I'm owner of Meta Urban Design, and I'm the project manager on this project. My team and I are focused a lot on the form piece of our analysis.
Brian Von Westford, former council member, Northside resident, where there's been a lot of development, and do some clean energy and climate action policy consulting.
Megan Robson, I'm a realtor. I work with Afari Real Estate. I'm also on the board for Habitat for Humanity, and I guess I am here because people either own homes or want to own homes.
I'm Dale Bickle. I'm the city's chief administrative officer.
Erin Pagan, the director of community planning, development, and innovation.
How about Jim? And
Jim's here, citizen advocate.
Thank you. All right, well, thanks. That's our introductions. So for anyone online, I don't think they can, that's trying to get in, there's no one showing up on the meeting, so I think it might be a Teams issue on that person's end.
Yeah, it's John over time.
But I'll keep an eye out for when they come up here. The next item on the agenda is a chance for public comment. So this is a time where if there's any members of the public that are here that are have any general comment that they'd like to make, this is a good time for it. And is there anyone who would want to say any words or any comments, Jim?
Well, I'm psyched the mayor's here, but also, no, I'm just looking forward to hearing the presentation.
Okay. Sorry.
If there's any time at the end.
All right, well, seeing none other, we can move on to the main part of the agenda, and I'll pass things over to Sam and her team.
Great, and I think Jamin's going to share. All right. So today we want to start with how we have before, just some old business. So we've been talking about some of our initial findings of the code diagnostic. So we can revisit our takeaways and just hear from you guys if you have any additional thoughts or questions or comments that you'd like to share from the material we've covered before. Then the bulk of the meeting today, the new business, will dive deeper into some of our additional findings. Specifically, we'll share our single dwelling zone test and then a commercial zone test. So Jamin will be leading most of the meeting today. You'll hear from him. But as we go along, we'll definitely want to hear from you, and we can, I think after the single dwelling zone test, we can take a break and hear any sort of questions and comments at that point too. And then the primary takeaway today is we want to think about what do these tests and these initial findings mean for this project. So that will be the primary theme of our discussion today. And we will end by talking about what you guys can expect coming up next. So jumping into the recap from last meeting, we shared the way we're approaching the diagnostic, again, in those three main categories of substance, organization and user friendliness, and process. Jamin has done a lot of the work around the code barriers to housing production, so that's where we've been looking at the market analysis of feasibility around how some of these development prototypes can get built and what sort of market implications we're looking at within those zone districts. We also touched on last time some of the zoning standards that are out of alignment with the existing form and character. We looked specifically at the university district as a case study with some of the non-conforming lot sizes, some of the non-conforming setbacks, and just the historical zone standards that now aren't quite syncing up with the existing zone standards. So we talked about that. And then we also touched on the misalignment between the existing code and the existing growth policy. And so that's one of the key issues we want to address in this project. We touched on the organization user friendliness around some of the inconsistencies, difficult to use organization. Many sections deal with this with similar topics, so it just requires a lot of cross-referencing and is difficult for people to use, especially if they're not familiar with the code already. And then we touched on the process. So some of the inconsistencies, some of the misalignments between the code and the policy creates more process and more room for interpretation, which leads to inconsistencies and just increases the length and the risk of the approval process. So I know there's a lot of details. There's 2 meetings worth of content just summarized on that slide. So we just wanted to pause before we move to the new content to see if you have any additional questions, comments, or anything you'd like to share about what we've covered so far. Okay. Jamin, you want to touch on the new topic for today?
Sure. So as Sam mentioned, we're going to be kind of taking you through a similar kind of analysis that we took you through in previous meetings. So this idea that there are kind of levers in the code and there are different ways that we can try to influence the kind of housing that is built and how affordable that housing might be, depending on how we pull those levers. And so we just find this as a useful way to kind of facilitate a discussion about some of the ways that code can influence housing development and housing affordability, but also other goals as well. And to kind of set up a discussion of what are some of these trade-offs that this project will have to grapple with as we move along and think about proposing specific code changes in the future. And so we thought we'd focus on, if you recall last meeting or the October meeting, we focused on the multi-dwelling zones. And so we wanted to turn to now some tests of the single dwelling zones, so some of the kind of lower density, single family, mostly neighborhoods in the city, and then also the commercial zones, which do allow for housing in those commercial corridors and centers. And so we have a couple of discussion questions here. We wanted to kind of give you a preview of, have you in the back of your mind as we go through this analysis. So, the single family side of things, kind of how do you feel about this idea of different housing options and types being allowed in single dwelling zones? And how do you think the city should approach that strategy of allowing a wide variety of housing types in a way that kind of meets all of the goals for all of Missoula, so not just housing affordability or equity, but also other considerations. And then in terms of commercial corridors, just how do you feel about that idea in general? And I think a big question there we want to pose is, how should the city balance the desire for commercial development on those commercial corridors with also the need and desire for more housing and more housing opportunities as well? There's a kind of a trade-off there in what the code prioritizes. So with those in mind, we'll start with the single dwelling zone test, and we'll pause before we go to the commercial. And so we chose to focus on, for this, the zoning standards for the R5.4 zone. And so the rationale for that is it covers a lot of the city. It's the most common single dwelling zone in the city. You can see the map here where it's map 2. And we also wanted to focus on this zone because it's probably the zone that is most impacted by some recent changes in state law. And so you might recall that we've discussed in the past that the state is now requiring that cities allow at least 2 units on every lot where it's in where a single dwelling is allowed. Basically, is how it's structured. So what that effectively means is that in this zone, which now exclusively allows single dwelling or single family housing, now duplexes will be allowed as well, on the same size of lots that a single family house will be allowed. So we want to take a closer look at that and see, okay, how might we expect that would, what kind of housing might that code change produce in the future? How does that, outcome compare to the goals of our Missoula? Is that moving the needle on the goals for the city that they have? Or are there other approaches that we can think about that would maybe be more effective? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just my question is, it's interesting to me that there isn't, you say it's like the largest type of single family dwelling, but it's all concentrated, on the lower side of Brooks. And it seems like there should be more of that yellow, like above Brooks and, south of West Broadway. And what's the zoning in all that other residential that isn't R5.4?
Yeah, it is interesting that it is kind of concentrated on the east and south side of the city.
Right.
But there's definitely other single dwelling zones on the west and north side. On the west and north side, there's far more multi-dwelling zones and single dwelling / duplex zones.
And is R5.4, the definition of that is simply single family dwelling?
Yeah, I think the title of it is, I think that the code prefers not to use the word family, I think, and it's just single dwelling.
Okay.
And so, but it is, the key 5.4 deals with the density. So it's 1 unit per 5,400 square feet.
I see, okay.
Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, and it's not explicitly called like dwelling or anything like that, but the only building types allowed there are detached homes.
Okay.
It's low density.
Okay, let's get into it. So Stan's team has put together some really nice graphics that kind of, and this is part of their work on capturing the existing development patterns in Missoula and some ways to use these graphics to help illustrate what the code does and does not allow and talk about these trade-offs. But this is a kind of a graphic to illustrate kind of a typical single dwelling neighborhood it varies quite a bit throughout the city and throughout the R5.4 zone. Some of them look a lot different than this, but this is somewhat typical in some parts of town. And so these lots are actually a little bit bigger than the minimum lot size, 8,000 square feet. But a lot of single level or maybe 1.5 story homes, 1,000 square feet, 1,500 square foot homes. So this is pretty typical in a large part of the city. So if we think about what kind of infill might happen, this is a context that the infill might happen in many places. And then the blue cubes that you see there are the illustration of what the zoning actually would allow. And so this is the kind of envelope that the zoning standards say that you can build within. So you could fill up a structure that fits within that envelope based on the setbacks and maximum height. You can see that a lot of the existing homes don't really maximize to that envelope. They're smaller. So that's one of the things we'll look at more closely.
And it's an important thing to remember because, right, folks think about their neighborhood in terms of the way it looks and feels today.
Because comments, man.
Right?
So we hear about it all the time.
Yeah. And the zoning today, like we didn't change anything yet, but the zoning today allows quite a lot more. Right? And so without a zoning change, without anything else, like I could on my property do something quite different than the rest of the neighborhood.
But it would still be a single
Be a
unit.
single unit today.
Like you could build a humongous house, which was one, yeah.
Right.
Because it still couldn't be like a duplex or a multifamily.
That's right, and that's exactly what we're digging into
Right.
today.
We have McMansion zoning.
Pardon?
We have McMansion zoning. Well, I think we have a McMansion to show you. And so coming back to this idea of the levers, and so what are the code standards that in our estimation would have the greatest impact on the kind of housing, potentially affordability of housing in these single dwelling zones? And so these are the ones that we identified as the most important. And so the maximum number of units per lot, so this is the requirement that we're going to be a single dwelling, so 1 unit per lot is the current standard. Minimum lot area per unit is 5,400 square feet, and that's a density regulation, and so affects how densely you can build. The height is effectively about 3 stories. That's what that envelope allows. Parking depends on the size of units, but it's generally for single dwelling 2 spaces per unit. The front and rear setbacks are about 20 feet, and then the side setbacks are 7.5 feet.
The circle, I mean, what is represented by where it is on this scale?
Yeah, so we put it on the scale to show kind of where we estimate that how high that is relative to kind of how high or low it is relative to other zones in the city and other similar kinds of zones in other cities. So it's a very just very kind of more of a science, but just to show you kind of where we think there's room to go up or down on that lever.
Sure, gotcha.
And another way of thinking about it is, we call them levers, but in some ways it's also a way of identifying what are the typical barriers. Right? So we sort of looking at it in terms of what is the problem that we might put on as a lever or some kind of adjustment to see how much that barrier can be reduced.
So is higher less barrier or more barrier on your lever there?
I think it depends on the lever. So for instance, max units, the more you have, the less of a barrier. Parking, the more you have, the more of a barrier. And so.
So with state law now, that 1 in the first column changes to 2, right? So can we see what just the difference of that makes? I appreciate you buying me the coffee there. Tell me to cue that up.
So we first wanted to start with, we showed you what is existing conditions in these neighborhoods. But there's also, as we mentioned, that a new single dwelling house could be significantly bigger than existing houses in the neighborhood. And so this model shows it is more of probably what a typical new infill of a single dwelling house may look like. So we collected some data and looked at what the typical unit sizes of new single family houses are, and they kind of come in and around 2,000 square feet. Plenty of them are way bigger, some a little smaller, but 2,000 square feet is kind of a median. And so what we did is went ahead and modeled, okay, what does 2,000 square feet look like on this typical lot? And that's your 2,000 square foot new single family house there in the middle, getting infilled in. And so here's where we start to run the financials of this to try to understand the potential affordability of that form of infill development. And so looking at the cost of development, land and construction, and running that through a financial pro forma analysis, we can estimate what price point would a developer need to yield in order for that project to be economically feasible, given a certain target financial return. They have to make money on the project, they have to cover their costs. What price do they need to hit in order for that to be economically viable to do? And so for this infill of a single family house, we estimated that at about $680,000 for a for sale, new single family house at this density for that unit size. And so that's what that blue dot is showing you there and relating that to income levels in Missoula. And so you need to be able to be earning to afford a $680,000 house about 240% of the AMI for area median income for a four-person household, which is about 100,000 in Missoula. So that's a relatively high income to afford that single-family house. New single-family houses that are being built today may be coming under that. Some of them are over that. This is kind of one estimate, wide range.
Yeah, Megan, I do have a question.
Oh, yeah.
What are you using for lot price as a basis for this? Like, how do you get a lot cost?
Yeah, so we collected data from the assessor and looked at land values actually in each zone district, and they created an estimate. And if I recall off the top of my head what it is on a per square foot basis for this zone, it's probably somewhere between $5 and $10 a square foot, I think. So for a 8,000 square foot, it's a vacant lot, $40,000 to $50,000.
That's fine.
Is that about right?
No, that seems low.
That would be delightful. If we could have another square lot, that would be.
I think it'd be more on the $10
I think it's more,
range of
yeah,
that.
it's probably more than the 10, yeah, I could pull up data here in a second.
Do you remember what you used for construction costs?
Yeah, for a single family house, I think it was 225. But
I mean, if I'm in a ballpark, just so you guys know, like if there was a vacant lot in 5.4 zoning, 8,000 square feet in Missoula, probably 200.
So even just make it.
Yeah.
Okay, look, I'm gonna actually just pull up my numbers here real quick, because I had it open, and so.
Chris was at construction costs.
Yeah.
For speculative higher density, yes. For single family, anywhere near custom, no.
Low. Low by.
Yeah, we have $7 to $10 a square foot, depending on the specific zone here. Yeah. So yeah, maybe that is low. Maybe that's optimistic.
So it's more like 300%.
I mean, we can do like the lots, if you find a house that is on a big enough lot and you can subdivide that lot and then get a lot carved out of that in order to build on. I think we can still hit 50, 60 sometimes, depending on what it is. But I mean, per door price in that zoning specifically, you're not gonna find an $80,000 lot.
Heather, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to emphasize, I agree on the land, and then I was going to ask Chris, you and I have had this conversation over the last few years, that cost per square foot for building a single family home is low, is it not?
For a single family home, that seems low. I think for townhomes and multifamily, that's probably in the range for single family.
Yeah. We've been seeing on multifamily, large scale multifamily, higher than that. So I just think that's a little soft, and we should probably do a little bit more research on that just to equate to the right numbers. So thanks.
I think we're sitting much higher for multifamily. It's either 275.
Townhomes are still, it just, things are expensive. So.
So as you can see, this is not, there's a lot of variability in this. This is not a exact range, but it does give us a sense to kind of get how roughly order of magnitude are we able to move the needle with changes in the code. That's a good kind of touch point then.
So Jamie, would you say regardless of, we can fact check and right size, but the order of magnitude of change will remain the same, even if those starting and ending numbers look a little different?
Yeah, for the most part, if land costs are a higher share, then increasing density is more beneficial. Yeah, so that would be important for us to see if we could calibrate that.
I have a comment here, a question. Well, I see one of the challenges being we're comparing it to the market price today. We're trying to intervene and do something that flattens that out a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, so what you see here is a gray bar we have. Oh, I'm not sharing anymore. So in the gray bar we have there, the darker gray, that's what we're showing as the market range. And the reason for that is to show kind of where would a developer likely like to have that price point be in order for that to be kind of in the middle of the market of what people are kind of willing to pay in Missoula for the most part, able to pay for the most part. It doesn't mean it's optimal for affordability. It just means that if it's closer to this gray range, it's probably more feasible, right?
It'll get built.
It'll get built more often. If it's above that gray bar range, then it's probably going to be a pretty high-end product. The price point is a little above where kind of the middle of the market is. And so if you're in the gray, it's probably going to be more. You can see more development. If you're above it, it's going to be kind of more select. But the idea is can we get that number in these zones so that there are options that are in the gray bar, but also more affordable. So how do we get it from that top right quadrant down more in the middle?
And again, the numbers are, well, the numbers are changing, right? They do change. And I think for us, right, the important highest level takeaway is, so these levers, these are the things that we have available to us in terms of exploring of what to change, what to talk about in terms of how the code can change. Because a lot of times people will say, well, just increase the density, well, just increase the height, just get rid of all the parking. Like that, maybe, but this allows us to sort of get a better sort of sense of what are the things that we have available to move, and how much moving this one, right, may reduce the barrier, but then what is the trade-off? Right, and that's sort of the complexity of this conversation. So the land costs, right, we can adjust and we'll update based on, right, to new additional information. But the important thing for us all to keep our eye on is this set of levers and how do we frame the conversations with the community in discussing which ones move and what happens when they move.
Because this is so, it seems like this is very foundational. Can you give an example of another lever or two that didn't make the cut, that if you were to stick it in there, they would do it?
In this zone, actually, I don't think there really are any others that have a significant impact on what you can build. Plenty of others that affect the design, and the details, the basic economics of it. These are most important. I can't think of anything else.
Yeah. I mean, one that's not in here that's would be for other types of buildings, landscaping or open space.
I'm just curious if anyone here at this table has other ideas of levers. Chris, is there another lever that's always been in your mind that's been prohibitive to or better building?
In the single family section, you mean?
Yeah.
Honestly, I think this is a good start. I mean, this is generally what we have available to us right now with our existing concept of zones.
But you don't look up there and say in the back of your head or like they're missing a lever that is, I mean, to me, this is all an exercise in understanding which of these levers, which is the big lever, are they all big levers or?
They're all big levers. They all have to be pushed. They all have to be pushed in one direction, and there is a huge amount of room just with these levers. I don't think we have to complexify any more than that, because we could make New York City with these levers.
But but taking the sophisticated approach where we can move the levers the right amounts, right, mitigates our unintended consequences. Getting rid of all parking, there's a lots of unintended consequences. Moving parking to where we know is gonna make these more marketable. That's level of sophistication is what we're trying to head to, right?
Well, and I think unintended consequences with no actual promise of affordability.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other key. The levers help us manage consequences, or make thoughtful decisions about trade-offs, but they also give us more information about what's really going to test to effective affordability.
I just want to be very, very careful about our assumptions about the specificity of what we can actually predict with these levers. So when we're saying that we're going to be able to predict what the unintended consequences are, I get really nervous. And so, you know, with the scale of the problem that we have, I think we're going to have to like push a little harder, especially because it's really hard to change this thing. You know, we have once in a generation or lifetime opportunity now. So I get that we need to be able to justify to the public that we're not destroying their city, but I get nervous when you tell me that you're going to be able to predict the unintended consequences.
And I'm sure that a part of this for you guys is going to be showing us how, you know, what could might happen, right? And there's always an idea that we might predict that, but I think we've all seen forever that no matter what you do, people are going to interpret that in their own way. And that, you know, this is not a process of getting it perfect. It's a process of getting it better. You know, and understanding that we can tweak along the way, but I mean, we are in a desperate place. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting to me about all of this too, is that when you look at those like $680,000, $700,000 homes, what we've seen as agents is that if you open up an $800,000 home, somebody moves up from a $600,000 home, and then somebody moves up from a $400,000 home, and then somebody, you know, just getting inventory in the market makes a huge difference for everybody along the line. So, you know, I think that what we're seeing is we just don't have any housing.
Yep.
Heather?
I was just gonna weigh in, agree with everything that was just said. I'm not sure that this is necessarily a toggle to add on single family, but it might be. I think we solved this already, but minimum unit size for the small homes. And I know you have minimum lot area per unit, those pieces, but would that be something we'd want to consider? I think in future, different zoning points, but maybe even in the single family. And I guess I'd lean back on staff because I cannot remember where we sit with minimum unit or minimum unit sizes.
Yeah, we don't have that.
Okay, so Bozeman struggled with it and I just couldn't remember if I was slurring the two. So that's great.
Heather, do you mean minimum or maximum?
Probably more
To try
probably
to.
a little of both. I mean, think about so if we don't have a minimum, then in Missoula it's okay. But a maximum, you're right, that ties more to the minimum lot area per unit calculations. It's a good question.
That's the existing kind of average size house in a lot of neighborhoods. But yeah.
That seems so low.
It's, yeah, for a kind of an older ranch house, it's not that common.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the last comment was really an important one relative to our next. Because again, right now, the minimum lot area per unit, 5,400 square feet. That relative to the height, the setbacks, that is only speaking to the use. Single dwelling unit needs 5,400 square feet. Now, how big can that single unit be? Turns out it can be pretty big, right? And so,
Mansion that we were talking about.
yeah, so without any, right, yeah, completely financially unconstrained, you know, someone who has all the money in the world, or whatever. And, I mean, there's nothing in the code that constrain the size of that single dwelling unit out of 5,400 square feet. You know, I mean, there is, but the upper limit ends up being a house that ends up probably, folks in the neighborhood are probably gonna notice the change.
We have entire overlays developed around 2 bigger homes.
That's right, right. So you have responded to that phenomenon, but it doesn't apply to everywhere. Right? Other neighborhoods, some neighborhoods, it. So it seems to have already been visited as a concern. I think one of the things that we do want to talk about is unit size, maybe maximum unit size. And so this is just part of the setup for that. But in single dwelling units or, you know, residential neighborhoods, these are the kind of changes that maybe are quite often the most controversial to manage. And these areas comprise most of the area of the city, right? So it's a very diffuse conversation. And so I think it is important to spend a lot of time on not only density and, you know, these kind of things about how many units do we get, but also how big and how many, and in what is the size of the vessel that they fit, right? So, yeah, so right now, I can do a pretty big single dwelling under the current code. Well, I guess.
Right, and so then, if we come back to this state mandate to allow duplexes, and so kind of what might a new duplex look like? This condition on these meeting the set of code standards. And so we tried to go ahead and model that. And so, we did not maximize the size of the units as we showed in this example, so just to kind of illustrate the upper ends of what's possible. But this is maybe more of what's likely in terms of an infill of a duplex on the same size lot. And so what this is 2 side-by-side units. Each of them are about 2,000 square feet, 2.5 or 3 stories. But this all fits within that envelope that the zoning allows. And so there would be no reason why a developer would need to build these units smaller. And so when we run the numbers on this and try to give an estimate of what is likely to happen, if you can't add more units, we generally assume that the developer is going to build slightly larger units because the larger units are going to be more profitable. And so we don't reduce the unit size just because you're building more units, unless there's some other reason why the developer would want to do that. And so with that, then if you kind of model, okay, what is the affordability benefit of having those 2 units on that same size lot? And I'm realizing the levers graphic here is off, so maybe just ignore that for a moment, yeah. But there's a small improvement in the minimum price point the developer needs to hit. And that's mostly from, if you assume the same land cost, I get 2 units on that plot of land, then my overall cost of development comes down a little bit. But still have to pay for my construction hard cost of the building don't change. I'm building the same size of units and as I was with a single dwelling house that's 2,000 square feet. So many of the economics don't change much, but it makes it a little bit more feasible to deliver at a little bit lower price point. And so there is a benefit there. You see, I think the price point we modeled here was about $615 for a new 2,000 square foot unit in a duplex.
A thought just came to my mind as we keep looking at the, sort of like the existing situation on the ground in this zoning in Missoula. It's like, are there any vacant lots? So, I mean, it's some of the older, and maybe something is ready to be raised and redone, but it's like Lewis and Clark and all those neighborhoods, they're gonna stay. And so I thought, well, could they duplex by going up, putting another story? Well, most houses aren't built to, withstand a second story. So it's like, well, what would be like, what would be the opportunity to increase density in this zone in Missoula as it stands? It seems like it would be somewhat limited simply because there's already houses on all those lots. I mean, the way that you show the graphic, it's almost more like minimum lot size is 5,400 square feet. These happen to be like 8,200. Well, then we're looking at ADU, aren't we?
Chris, did you have a thought?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, when you don't have a lot of spare land, it just increases the cost of your land because you have to buy an existing house. So it drives up the cost of land and therefore makes all the more important how many units you can put on it, because you're essentially taking that amount that gets split up evenly over all the units and makes it a lot more. So if you're gonna, this is why we have existing RT 5.4 zoning, which allows duplexes, and many of those lots aren't 10,800 square feet, which is what you would need. But even the ones that are, you end up having to pay $500,000 or $600,000 for a house. And so now your land cost is $250,000 or $300,000 per lot. So it just doesn't make financial sense. So even if we have the theoretical zone capacity, there's not a financial capacity to do it.
Yeah, the dwelling units per acre is the same. I mean, it's a 2-unit zone. I need 5,400 square feet for each of the units. So it's.
So that, of course, would have to change.
Well, it did.
But the other potential thing then is that if I'm a person who wants to live in a house with a nicely sized lot without having, McMansions or duplexes or whatever, then the value of those are gonna go up, right? Because people are gonna compete for those.
That's an amenity, they're gonna pay for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think your point on the capacity for the overall kind of number of units you could expect in developed neighborhoods in terms of infill and redevelopment is important, that these, like, most of the housing production is probably going to happen in vacant greenfield sites on the edge of town, where more of the housing capacity is going to happen. But for a variety of reasons, we don't want to assume that these zones can't welcome more housing.
Sure.
Development, because there's a lot of benefits to that in terms of equity and sustainability.
Right.
Infill next to transit and.
I think my point is simply that in order to increase density in a neighborhood that is so filled in already, if duplex or multiplex isn't an option because what's existing would be too expensive, it's not a scraper, it's an actual, livable space that would be too expensive to redevelop, then the increase in units really would make more sense because the lot size is too big. I mean, what's already over there is more than the minimum, even as the minimum currently exists. Then the ADU makes more sense, like to push for that type of development in a single family neighborhood. Does that make sense?
It makes it because you're keeping the existing home and.
The existing home has already got like these minimal setbacks, front, sides, but in your picture where there's really room is in those backyards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
You can do that. I mean, you can take a benefit of this new duplex state mandate. It doesn't have to be a duplex building type. It can be two.
Oh,
detached
two
units.
on, okay, all right, gotcha.
In different communities have different words, different. Yeah, in Denver, we call those tandem houses. So you have a
Okay.
front house and a back house, and they can be the same.
Mhm.
Or you can organize them as attached
Sure,
duplex.
sure. I thought of duplexes as having at least one adjacent wall, yeah,
And so that, I mean, there are cost efficiencies to.
sure. But if there's not the
But
opportunity.
under the state
Yeah.
law, it doesn't require it to be an attached product. It could
Okay.
be.
And we're gonna devote some time just later in the meeting, I think, to looking at the duplex bill and kind of what that means. And so, but I think it's a great point. I mean, this kind of conversation it's been changed, and based on that recent legislation.
So again, there's the use, single dwelling unit.
Mhm.
Then there's, right, currently in your code, the density, which is 1 unit per 5,400 square feet. So these are the components that we are looking at, because your RT zone is not two dwelling before, Steve changed. Before it was not 2 units on 5,400 square feet. It was 2 units on 10,800 square feet because you needed per dwelling unit 5,400 square feet.
Sure.
So it's a 2-unit use.
That doesn't change lot size.
Right, that requires it, right? So that's that's a really important sort of distinction in understanding use from whatever the density controls are. In this case, you have minimum lot area per unit. So we're gonna be visiting all of these, that's why they're on the board for adjustment. But what we're trying to do is not just leave it in the abstract numbers, but to develop these kind of visual models so that we can communicate with the community of what moving these numbers, like floor area ratio, or FAR, what? Right? Even parking ratios, right? So, but if we can visualize them better, hopefully we can engage the community in a more accessible way to understand what the potential outcomes, like and how it may, what kind of change might it bring to the neighborhood? Because I don't know if, and the state mandate says you have to allow 2 units where single units allowed. Was there anything in the law that says if you do it, the height of the building is limited? We can control the height of the building, right? And so you say, well, the second unit has to be in the back or whatever. Then when from the street, nothing changes. I mean, the neighborhood looks the way it looks. I just have more units on that site. You don't even see the other unit from the street. So anyways, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can talk about this, but this is just this turning point and kind of how we approach this.
Right. So I'm going to skip over this just to get to more of that bigger picture question that Peter was going at. But just generally, one thing we're trying to do here is apply some of the goals of our Missoula project to this specific change. In general, this allows for duplexes. We found to be, it would create new opportunities for new housing. So it's kind of a positive on housing supply overall. It's good, probably. Doesn't really move the needle too much on affordability. It may move the needle a little bit on equity, just providing us some other options for housing in those single dwelling zones. But there are some really concerns around form and character. There's not a lot of control on what those duplexes will look like, and there's potential for those to really kind of be out of scale and incompatible in a lot of different contexts. But with that all in mind, I think the question we want to pose to you all and kind of for really it's a policy question for the growth policy update is, are there ways that we can allow infill in these single dwelling zones that addresses both kind of the compatibility and scale of buildings, but also the economics of what makes for affordable housing at the same time. And I think that what we're finding with the thing like allowing just 2 units per lot is that may not move the needle that much on affordability. And is there opportunity there to allow more units per lot or more density, but also at the same time more kind of controls on the scale and compatibility of those units? And I think there's a potential win-win there to creating more compatible infill, but also where you're more likely to get some smaller and more affordable units. And that's really the key there. I think cities that have had success in addressing infill and single dwelling zones has been to try to encourage more smaller units in these in the infill situations. And so smaller, not necessarily studio small, but not 2,000 square feet, So that's I think the policy kind of question we want to set up is, how can you try to achieve both compatible infill, but also a little higher densities that's gonna enable more affordability.
So one way to think about it is right now, your code, like a lot of cities, privileges fewer big houses versus more smaller houses.
Right.
Right, I mean, that's the way the code works. You know, I mean, it's America, so that's,
Quick
you know, the bigger the better.
That reduce one-to-one replacements, can you just confirm what that means?
Yeah, so what we're saying there is if you're gonna see infill in single dwelling zones today, and even under the duplex law, you may still be more likely to see a single family house replacing a single family house, probably a larger one replacing a single family house, which is okay, there's new housing supply, and maybe the old house was not meeting a need, but would it be better?
It's not
if
ideal.
Yes,
Yeah.
if that were 2 or 3 units replacing that one
Right,
single
right.
family house.
Yeah.
So I think from a policy perspective, that's what the code would want to kind of encourage.
And so the economics from a developer's point of view is that if you're going to do a 1-for-1, are you gonna replace a single with a new single? If there was a limit on the size of that single, when you single unit, it wasn't so much different than what's there, then that just might not work out, that it's worth scraping that house and building a house that's not much bigger than what
Sure.
it replaced is, right? It's in the delta that makes it an attractive redevelopment. So in a lot of communities, when we talk about it, people sort of see, I don't want to see the buildings getting scraped, but if, especially if it's a 1-for-1 replacement, right? It's a modest house that gets replaced by a big mansion. That seems to give people, is more kind of offensive to folks than, well, maybe if it gets replaced, but it delivers 3 units, or if it's duplex, and they're more, like, that ends up being in many communities more acceptable. And in some communities, not always, but that's kind of the proposition there. And so, and then the last point about building reuse is that, you know, in some codes, if you keep the existing building, you know, like, let's say the limit is gonna be up to 3 units. Or limit of this zone is up to 2 units. If you reuse the building, you can get a third. And you can do an ADU, so you can effectively get 4 units. So just thinking about incentives for using existing buildings and throwing away the embodied energy materials and all.
Any other thoughts or questions on the single dwelling? It's kind of wrapping up this segment. I think we want to get to the commercial corridors as well. What time should we leave? How much time should we leave at the end?
We got for the end?
Yeah. Try to wrap up this.
Just like 5 minutes. Or...
Okay.
I think it would be interesting on that, where you showed the effect of the law going to 2 and the drop down, which was smaller than I sort of expected it to be, but regardless, I think it would be interesting to see what that looks like for 3 or 4 as well.
Yeah, if we go to
Keeping
3
everything
and then
else the same.
1,500 square feet instead of 2, yeah.
It'll look better, yeah.
I mean, I know that, but again,
That's how much better.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just as a sort of follow-up, I think we would do the same practice we've been doing, which is at our next meeting, come back to more on this question if you want, and sit with it, dive, and then come back and spend a little more time on it at that point too. So we're gonna move on to talking about the commercial levers.
But we love
a
that
lot
part.
to think about. And know there's old business at the next meeting.
Sure.
Great. So one of the other changes in state law that the legislature handed down this summer was that for residential development in commercial zones, that the city cannot require more than 1 parking space per unit. and I believe it's probably limited to multi-dwelling. Remember exactly, yes, yeah. But with the goal there, I think that the idea there, I think from the legislature, that we have a lot of opportunity and capacity for more, particularly apartments in commercial zones, and we should try to remove some barriers to those getting built. Parking can be one of those barriers to multifamily development in commercial areas. And so what we wanted to do is look at with one test case of a commercial zone in Missoula, and this is the C2-4 zone, which is a commercial zone that's along some corridors on Reserve and a couple of places, and look at what that specific change, how much that moves the needle on potential affordability in the commercial zones. It's a bit complicated of how you can build housing and what set of zoning standards apply to housing in commercial zones. So this diagram tries to lay that out. And the key distinction here is today in Missoula, if you're building just apartments, so no retail or commercial component to it, or if you're building a mixed use building, but it doesn't meet certain criteria for being what's in the code is defined as a vertical mixed use building, then any of those, a single purpose residential or mixed use building, you're basically subject to the same standards that regulate multifamily development in the multi-dwelling zones. And so the key to those standards that we covered, if you remember, we did some tests on the multi-dwelling zones in the RM 145 zone in the last meeting. One of the most important standards there is the density limit at 1 unit per 1,000 square feet. And so that's what we found to be one of the most important in combination with minimum parking requirements. And so,
Jamie, can I just jump in and just a quick kind of summary of how the zoning works within the business and commercial districts, just for those of you who don't know, maybe just to sum it up really quick. The RM1 zoning district, that's our high density residential district and it allows for the multi-dwelling buildings. So it's apartment buildings or 3 or more units in a building. So a single purpose residential building, that's just dwelling, that's just residential, just apartments or units, versus mixed use has some commercial component. So the way that our business and commercial zoning districts work in town is that they are where we allow for kind of more commercial uses, but they also allow for anything that's allowed in that RM1 zoning district, which has that high density multi-dwelling, allows for that high density multi-dwelling use as well. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Right. But there is one kind of carve out in the commercial zone that says if you're doing this vertical mixed use building, you meet certain criteria for how much commercial space is included on the ground floor of the building. So ground floor retail or commercial, upper stories residential, and some other standards on size and ceiling heights and things like that. Then you are not subject to that density limit of 1 unit per 1,000 square feet. So there's kind of what's intended to be an incentive for vertical mixed use. And so the code saying in these commercial corridors, we would prefer to see housing come in the form of retail on the bottom and housing above, because we're getting kind of the best of both worlds. Then we're not just losing commercial land for residential, we're getting a little bit of both.
That 1 unit per 1,000 square feet, you're talking about the land size, not minimum unit size.
Yes, that's
Okay.
1 unit per 1,000 square feet, a lot area.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're doing that vertical mixed use building, then your density is effectively governed by other things that control how many units you can fit on the lot, which is mainly parking, landscaping, setbacks, and the building height. So we'll get into that. So we wanted to test the vertical mixed use scenario because that's what the code is kind of privileging now. But we also kind of know some standards that we tested the multi-dwelling zones already. So here are the key levers in those C2 zones. So in addition to height or stories, and the others are the minimum amount of commercial space that's required. So today, if you are eligible for that, be considered a vertical mixed use building, you need to provide at least commercial space that is equal to 20% of the area of the site. It's a 10,000 square foot site. You have to have 2,000 square feet or at least of retail space or commercial space on the ground floor of the building. And then you also have to provide parking for that commercial space. And the amount of parking you have to provide depends on the specific use, but generally it falls somewhere in the range of what we've estimated here, 481 parking space for every 480 square feet of commercial space. Then you have to provide parking for the residential units as well. And then the lot area per unit isn't actually eligible or apply here, but we wanted to show it to give you a sense of how different it is from what you would get if you were doing just a single purpose residential building. Then lastly, landscaping does affect things a little bit here. It's 15% of the site. There are no setbacks in the commercial zone, so those don't have really play a role, but the landscaping does. So then if we apply the existing code, this is the kind of typical kind of building we would be, I think, you'd likely to be seen, I think have been seen in some places in Missoula in the commercial zone. So key thing here is we're assuming this building just has surface parking. If you assume that it has structure or underground parking, you could go higher and get more units potentially. That's also more expensive, and many developers have found that is prohibitively expensive. And so we kind of start with the assumption, okay, what could you do if you just did surface parking? And so it's about 30 units you can fit in this 4-story building, and you're required to provide about 6,000 square feet of commercial space on that ground floor. So that's what that red area is.
Where is the parking in that picture? Is it those little squares?
Yep, yeah, it's around it's around the.
Oh, so that's a street in between the two. Okay, I get you.
Yes, the good division the street is being, we're viewing the building from the street. Yes, yeah. Okay, so how does that perform on relative affordability? And so I think relative to the multi-dwelling zones, it's actually a bit worse than multi-dwelling zones. And part of the reason for that is you're getting about the same density as those zones. But you do have to provide that commercial space on the ground floor. And at the rents that we're assuming for the commercial space, that it actually is a kind of negative impact overall on the feasibility of the project. It's potential that you could get some pretty high rent tenants, and that would be more attractive of a project. But what we're seeing and what we've heard from developers and seen in the market is that the commercial space can be hard to lease up, and there's worries about it sitting vacant for if they can't find the right tenants, and the rents don't really haven't really kept up with the construction costs of providing that space, and so it's kind of a drag on the overall feasibility of a project. But the other important thing here is that you don't actually, as you can see at the lot area per unit, even though there is a density bonus, and theoretically you could exceed 1 unit per 1,000 square feet in the code, because you have to provide parking for the commercial space and you have to provide the commercial space, both of those things take away from the number of units you can provide in the building. You actually can't really exceed that density of 1 unit per 1,000 square feet unless you go underground or structured parking, which is prohibitively expensive. So just an interesting thing is that the code today has this density bonus, tries to encourage vertical mixed use, but that bonus is sort of sort of a theoretical paper bonus, doesn't really give you much. And so I think a lot of developers are finding that I'm not really going to use this anyway, so I'll just do a multi-dwelling building.
Just as an aside, this is like one of the more expensive things you can try to build.
Yeah.
Because of fire elevators and fire suppression.
Yeah, you have building code requirements go up when you're making uses.
Well, I think too, the other thing is that you're modeling this as a rental, which it almost has to be. I think that, and I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when you put commercial into something, it becomes harder to lend on it for somebody who wants to buy. So, this doesn't work really for modeling for ownership units, which.
Ownership of the,
Yeah.
of the dwelling units, yeah.
Yeah, like if you have condos and the condos are above, commercial space, it becomes much harder to lend on those condos.
But I mean, it has been done, like.
Yeah, it has been.
Yeah, but it's, yeah, I agree with you.
But usually, I mean, I guess in my experience, and I'm not a banker, so I don't know the answer to this, but in my experience, it typically would have pretty significant down payment. And
And
that's.
there have to typically be, pre-leasing at a fairly high, or pre-sales, I'm sorry, at a fairly high level, et cetera, yeah.
So it becomes prohibitive.
It gets.
So one clarification, and I don't know if Madam Mayor is still sitting there and she'd know the answer to this, but I think the law that required the 50% down and pre-sold has shifted. It's not all the way gone. So I don't know if that's true anymore. And from the sense of our previous experience on condo ownership. And I'd also say, I mean, there are added complexities because you have to have fire separation, different structures between the units. So the homes are a little bit more expensive, but I'm not sure it would be something not sure this group needs to understand it, but we really should dig in a little bit because I think it's a little more attainable than it used to be on that lending side. Another comment, I know everybody always says that underground parking is more expensive. We fight this battle all the time because the parking is the tail that wags the dog on the development. That's what we're talking about here. But we've managed to put underground parking on our, housing credit homes on most of our last projects because we're trying to increase the density and make it feasible. And we argue with the contractors and up front, but then at the end of the day, they're like, oh, we already had to dig a hole. We were already going to do that much of a stem wall for the foundation. And you have to account for the fact you don't need all that surface parking and there's cost to that. So it's negligible. I just say this to this group for working knowledge. It is possible. That's the only way to get around the tail wagging the dog on this surface parking. I just don't think we should dismiss it outright as not possible. And I don't know if the city can incentivize any way there from a growth policy standpoint, coming back to the point of this group, but it's worth a conversation because I think you guys are nailing it. That's what dictates how many homes we can build here. Parking regulates everything, unfortunately, still.
Okay, so this is the kind of existing condition, and so what we wanted to do is go ahead and test that parking reduction that is now required, the city is required to allow for residential and commercial zones. And so the important thing here is that you can see the lever is changing, and so the parking per unit going down from what was about 1.3 spaces per unit to one space, just 1-to-1 spaces per unit. So your effective density goes up, and so you can see you went from 31 units to 31 to 41 units on the site. The overall form of the building doesn't change a lot because you can still fit 41 units on that 4-story building. I think the building gets a little deeper, a little bigger. And you don't really have to add as many parking spaces, and so you can squeeze in those more units. But we still get stuck at about that 41 units on this site. And the reason for that is if we're not going into structured or underground parking, is that the parking reduction under the state law doesn't apply to the commercial space. And so you still have to provide, under this scenario, 14 spaces for the commercial. And so if that wasn't required, you probably could add another wing to this building and get quite a few more units on the site.
And does this scenario assume a reduction in lot size per unit?
Well, because it's vertical mixed use,
Yeah.
it doesn't apply.
But you modeled it on the prior slide at 1,000, or are you just showing?
It's just showing it at 1,000,
Okay,
so
but
it
it's not,
ends up
it's
being
not part of the
1,000.
equation.
It's not
Okay.
required to be 1,000, but that's kind of where it's funny, because that's actually where it kind of ends up if you have surface parking.
So it reduces slightly with the
Yeah,
reduction of
parking goes
parking
down,
and
you can't
increase
get-
in units.
You can get that higher density. But yeah, so this, the interesting thing here is that commercial space, how much commercial space is required, how much parking is required for that commercial space. And then even a bigger picture question of, should commercial space be required to build at this higher density? And it is a big picture policy question we want to pose about housing in commercial corridors, but that's really the remaining lever here, in addition to going further down on parking for residential is another potential here. So we're still only at one space per unit. There may be developers in certain locations and targeting certain kinds of households that would potentially respond to having parking below one space per unit. They could get more units, and that would reduce the minimum price point they need to get for each unit. So there's an affordability benefit to going lower. It's not clear how many developers would go lower, but I think it's on the table in terms of a lever that could make a difference. So we wanted to also show the scenario of if you did comply or apply those state reductions in parking, and then you also tried to build the structured parking garage instead of surface. And so you can see the difference as we toggle back and forth here between surface parking, you kind of get maxed out at 4 stories. If you do structured parking, you can get 4 stories on top of 2 levels of structured parking. We assume that these are above ground structured parking. I believe to be slightly less expensive than underground, but maybe some might find a combination of underground and above ground. But either way, the difference in cost, construction cost for both the parking spaces and then also the building itself is more expensive due to some of the building code requirements as you go higher. Actually kind of, you get higher density, but your development cost per unit is so high that you really need to be at a higher price point for that project expensive. So it kind of goes backwards. So it's like we get more density, but you don't really get greater affordability. And so that's where the parking lever is important, because the choice now is between more units, but they're going to be more expensive, or fewer units, and I can provide them at a price point that may be closer to where the middle of the market is. So I think that's what the developers are struggling with, or that's what they have to choose between now with the way the code's set up. And the question is there a way for them to provide less parking or less parking for the commercial spaces so they don't have to go into that structured or underground prototype that is more expensive to build?
And this came up yesterday in another meeting, but I think it also highlights or challenges this narrative that maximum density always equates to higher affordability. And sometimes there's this middle ground, there's a sweet spot before you get to the cost associated with really high density housing versus, 4 stories or a smaller purpose-built facility.
The question, I guess, about the, but are we still going on modeling, Jamin, or do you have policy considerations for this?
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah, and I think another lever that's not reflected here, I think we talked about it with the multi-dwelling zones is, so today, one of the ways that the city tries to incentivize income restricted or deed restricted affordable housing is through providing a reduction in parking for projects that include a certain number of income restricted units. And so can be another kind of lever to add here is kind of how many income restricted units and at what depth of affordability, and then get that. That's another incentive potentially that would make potentially some of these projects will not only serve the higher income, but also potentially serve partially some of that lower or moderate income households. So it's just another thing to throw in there. We didn't want to complicate it with that, but you have to come back to that. But just to mention, that's another tool on the table.
Have we unpacked what our very challenged legislature passed that we excluded inclusionary zoning? We can't do that anymore. I don't know if that's been a discussion, and I don't know if we can set up with the workarounds. I just wanted to, because we would love to see this, but I'm not sure how we can do it structurally with what passed the state level.
Well, and I think that there are pieces in other legislation that have been passed that signal kind of that continuing strong desire from the legislature that we incentivize, but we not mandate. And so I think we'll only
carrot, not stick, right?
Yeah. I think we'll continue to move in that direction. So
okay.
So I have a question about this, maybe something for this group to understand a little more, think about more as we move ahead with this is when we talked about the implications on the residential side, on the modeling for the residential district. When it came to thinking about kind of what the growth policy considerations are, do you see those questions as being kind of uniformly for the city at large, or is there kind of a piece of where this is going that there are different contexts where these levers might be adjusted differently for given, whether it's based on the place type, the different place types that we've been talking about, or other ways of kind of looking at how does this get applied to specific areas in the city that we looking at?
Yeah. Was that a question for us?
I think I'm putting that together. Is this kind of get brought over into the place type approach as a way to kind of construct those and figure out what they mean?
Yeah. So we're kind of taking one zone, a typical condition as just an example here to kind of dive in and show one of the levers. But particularly in the residential areas, there are many areas in the city today where the existing context of what's built there is very different, but it's in the same zone or in the same land use designation for the growth policy. And so
what's currently there is inconsistent with the zoning or is that what you're saying?
More so that the neighborhoods are diverse, but they're in the same set of regulations is applied.
So they might have been, right, they were developed in those eras that we talked about, right? The early days of the city and streetcar and the pattern of houses and streets and blocks, compared to the later years, were more ranch scale or one-story houses, right? So same zone, but they look completely different.
So to be most effective, we're talking about here one example of pulling some levers that you might also want to, at the same time, break apart the zones to be more responsive to the existing conditions so that you can change the levers a little bit differently in each zone.
I see.
Yeah, I think
with the goal being to increase density or to
both increasing density in each of those cases.
Yes.
But the manner in which the building form, the resulting building form,
Right,
occurs might be different.
okay.
And so maybe where you have a neighborhood where there's more common see 2-story or 1.5-story homes versus everything's 1 story.
Right.
That the way that the method for allowing more density in those areas that the older areas that might have slightly taller buildings is there are more incentives for conversion of existing buildings because you always might find some really big houses that can be converted to or that those measures might be different than, let's say, in other parts of the city where maybe there's more ability to cover more of the lot or the form controls might be different.
Gotcha.
But the goal of providing more opportunity for more housing and more, for more people to have the opportunity to live in more neighborhoods is the same.
So we're running out of time here. We just have another minute or two, so I'm gonna jump in and we wanted to just be sure to let you this group know about some of the upcoming community events that we have planned. So I want to make sure we cover that. Was there anything else before that we wanted to close out with?
I don't think so. I mean, I think maybe for next time, we'll send out these slides and kind of ponder these questions more related to the commercial corridors, which is kind of how do we essentially balance this opportunity for more housing and higher density housing in places where there probably is a lot of capacity for infill and opportunity for a lot of new development, but also there's a desire for there to be some commercial. Commercial zones are for. They're supposed to have some commercial uses, and so if you think about kind of where you think in the city should the city be prioritizing commercial uses, and where maybe we should be a little more flexible about having higher density residential. Right now, it's pretty universal kind of set of standards that everywhere there's a commercial zone, it's primarily wanting commercial development only. And so can we be a little bit more flexible on that to try to accommodate more housing? That's the main question we have.
Great. Thanks. Do we have a slide for the events on the slide?
Yeah.
Just skip it. Oh, there it is. Thanks, Emily. Do you mind? Or
Sure.
you wanna
And I emailed all of you, so I've been spamming you with this information already. But we're holding 3 events starting next Monday. The first one is at Good Works on Monday in the afternoon, and then another one on Wednesday at the fairgrounds, and then the following Wednesday at the public library. And these are really to launch our growth policy process. And just, I think the tagline is confirming our values with community members, and it kind of ties into this conversation about levers. And it'll be pretty low-key conversations, asking people what they like in their neighborhood and what they care about and what have they noticed has changed and what do they want to change. And that'll really set up helping us determine if we need to update the growth policy to align with what people care about now. So I invite you all to attend. I invite you all to share this with your networks and everyone you know. And yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, we have flyers here at the. So grab a flyer, grab another muffin before you go.
And just to forewarn folks, it's our committee day and our Public Works and Mobility Committee is in session. So when you exit the room, if you could be mindful of that. Or if you're interested, they're presenting the transportation options report. You could pop in and.
So walk through council chambers throughout the back door.
Yeah.
It's what you're telling me is it's a good time to go raise my hand about potholes in my neighborhood?
Yes.
And just
right is when it happens.
sorry, just a couple more things really quick before you leave. We're presenting also to council at 1 today on this project, giving an update to LEP committee if you're interested in that. And then I just wanted to, yeah, as far as these meetings go, you know, we are anticipating probably more than a monthly basis for at least for the foreseeable future, but we need to land on that. And we do appreciate the feedback we've gotten on your availability. Next month, it's the holidays, so it's probably going to be another scheduling kind of dilemma, but we'll try to find a time that works as best we can. And then hopefully after that, we'll get into more regular cadence going into the new year. We sent out a survey on just kind of looking for input and ideas on how we can improve on running these meetings and your time, how to spend your time here. And so we're really interested in that. And so just want to urge you again, if you haven't had a chance to fill that survey in, that's helpful to us, and we may circle back on that with the group to talk through some of what we hear. And yeah, am I missing anything else? Okay, well, that's all I
Go to
had.
chat, just in case.
Okay. Right. And John Wolverton is in the meeting and has shared out a article for this group that looks interesting that we can follow up with to the group here as well. So thanks for your time. I'm going to turn off the recording, and then we'll stick around in the room here for a few minutes if anybody wants to follow up on anything or have any questions. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Did you get
Thanks.
sale data on